Commander Vexthal of the Dominion Fleet considered himself something of an artist. Not the messy, emotional kind that smeared paint on canvas or wrote terrible poetry about their feelings, mind you. No, Vexthal was an artist of conquest, a virtuoso of subjugation, and today... Well, today he was about to conduct his masterpiece. The human colony ship Wayward Sun drifted through the Kepler Nebula, blissfully unaware that it had just sailed into the galaxy's most elegant trap. Vexthal's 3 Dominion cruisers hung in perfect formation, cloaked and waiting like predators around a watering hole. The commander's scaled fingers drummed against his command throne as he reviewed his tactical display one final time. "Sir," his tactical officer, a nervous creature named Plix, chittered from his station. "The human vessel shows no signs of detecting our presence. Shall we proceed with the operation?" Vexthal's mandibles clicked in what passed for a smile among his species. "Patience, Plix. Art cannot be rushed." He gestured at the holographic display showing the human ship's internal layout. "Observe the beauty of it. 632 adult humans aboard that vessel. But do you know what makes this conquest inevitable? Superior firepower, sir." "Boring. Try again." "Advanced tactical positioning?" Vexthal's eye stalks swiveled to fix his subordinate with a withering stare. "Think, you evolutionary dead end. What is the one weakness every species in this sector shares? The one fatal flaw that transforms warriors into whimpering prey?" Plix's throat sac quivered with uncertainty. "Their attachment to offspring, sir." "Exactly." Vexthal rose from his throne, spreading his forearms wide in theatrical triumph. 108 human cubs aboard that vessel, Plix. 108 precious, helpless little creatures that their adult counterparts will sacrifice everything to protect. The commander had spent considerable time studying human behavioral patterns. Their psychological profiles made for fascinating reading, if you enjoyed that sort of thing. Humans, it seemed, possessed an almost pathological need to shield their young from harm. They would charge into certain death, abandon all tactical advantage, surrender unconditionally, all to prevent their precious cubs from experiencing so much as a scraped knee. It was almost touching, really. Also, completely exploitable. "Decloak the fleet," Vexthal commanded, settling back into his throne with the satisfaction of a chess master calling checkmate. "Let's give our guests a proper welcome." The 3 Dominion cruisers shimmered into visibility around the human vessel like nightmares materializing from thin air. Each ship stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, bristling with enough firepower to glass a small moon. The Wayward Sun, by comparison, looked about as threatening as a soap bubble in a hurricane. Vexthal opened a communication channel to the human ship, his universal translator converting his words into their primitive language. "Human vessel, this is Commander Vexthal of the Dominion Fleet. You are surrounded and outgunned. Prepare to be boarded." The response came quicker than expected. A woman's voice, steady, but carrying just the right hint of fear. "This is Captain Cora Blackstone of the Wayward Sun. We're a civilian transport carrying families. We pose no threat to your forces." "Oh, Captain Blackstone," Vexthal practically purred, "I'm counting on that." The boarding operation proceeded with textbook precision. Dominion shock troops swarmed through the Wayward Sun's corridors, their heavy boots clanging against the deck plating. The humans offered no resistance, just as Vexthal had predicted. They huddled in groups, wide-eyed and terrified, while his soldiers efficiently catalogued their numbers. But it was the children who truly made the commander's plan sing. Human cubs, as it turned out, came in various sizes and configurations. Some barely reached knee height, tottering around on uncertain legs while making incomprehensible noises. Others stood nearly as tall as adults, but possessed that unmistakable awkwardness that marked them as juveniles. All of them, however, shared one crucial characteristic. They were absolutely precious to their adult counterparts. Vexithal watched through his tactical display as his soldiers herded the human cubs into specially designed containment pods. The adults pressed forward, reaching through the energy barriers, calling out reassurances that everything would be fine. Their desperation was palpable, delicious, and completely predictable. "Sir," Plix reported, "all human offspring have been secured in Holding Bay 6. The adults are, well, they appear to be in considerable distress." "Excellent!" Vexthal studied the tactical feed from the holding bay. The human cubs sat in neat rows behind their energy barriers, looking around with what appeared to be curiosity rather than fear. Interesting. Perhaps human young were simply too primitive to understand their situation. One particularly small cub, a female with dark hair tied in something humans called pigtails, seemed to be examining the energy barrier with unusual interest. She poked at it experimentally, then turned to whisper something to the cub beside her. Vexithal dismissed it as typical juvenile behavior. Captain Blackstone's voice crackled over the comm again. "Commander, our children are frightened. Surely there's no need to—" "Oh, but there is every need, Captain," Vexthal interrupted smoothly. "You see, I've made quite a study of human psychology. Your species' obsession with protecting its young is well documented. Rather touching, actually, in a primitive sort of way." He paused, savoring the moment. This was always his favorite part. "Here's how this will proceed," he continued. "You have 1 standard galactic hour to surrender your vessel and all personnel, unconditionally. During this time, your cubs will remain safely contained in our holding bay. They will not be harmed, provided you cooperate fully. And if we refuse?" Vexthal's mandibles clicked with amusement. "Oh, Captain, we both know you won't refuse. No human parent has ever chosen warfare over the safety of their precious offspring. It's simply not in your nature." The comm channel went silent. Through the tactical display, Vexithal could see Captain Blackstone standing on her bridge, surrounded by her crew. They were talking in hushed, urgent tones, exactly as his psychological profiles predicted they would. Fear, desperation, the crushing weight of impossible choices. It was all so beautifully orchestrated. In Holding Bay 6, the human cubs continued their whispered conversations. The small female with the pigtails seemed to be drawing something in the condensation on the energy barrier. Probably some primitive artistic expression, a coping mechanism for her underdeveloped mind. Vexthal settled back to wait. The humans would need time to process their situation, to accept the inevitability of surrender. They always did. He'd used this exact strategy on the Rigelians, the Cetacean Collective, the crystal beings of Proxima 7. Every species crumbled when their young were threatened. "Sir," Plix ventured, "what if the humans attempt some kind of rescue operation?" The commander's laughter echoed through the bridge. "With what? That obsolete transport vessel? Plix, my dear subordinate, that ship couldn't punch through a paper bag, let alone our defensive systems. And even if they could, they'd never risk harming their precious cubs in the process." He gestured at the tactical display showing the containment bay. "Those energy barriers can hold creatures up to 5 times human strength. The neural dampeners prevent any emotional outbursts that might disturb the other prisoners. And the entire bay is under constant surveillance by our most advanced security systems. The cubs appear to be organizing something, sir. Vexthal glanced at the display. The human offspring had indeed formed some kind of circle, with the pig-tailed female at the center. She appeared to be distributing small objects to her fellow prisoners, probably sharing food or comfort items, the sort of primitive bonding behavior common among lesser species. Let them play their little games, Plix. It will keep them occupied while their parents make the only logical choice. The hour was nearly half over, and Vexthal could practically taste victory. Soon, the humans would surrender. Another species would kneel before the Dominion's might. Another perfect example of how superior intellect and strategic thinking could overcome any opposition. In the holding bay, 9-year-old Annie Garrett finished explaining her plan to the other children, her voice barely a whisper. She'd been studying the energy barriers for the past 20 minutes, and she was pretty sure she knew how they worked. More importantly, she was absolutely certain she knew how to make them not work. The alien guards, magnificent in their superiority, continued to monitor their primitive prisoners through their advanced surveillance systems, completely unaware that they were about to receive a crash course in human engineering. The kind taught by cubs who'd grown up taking apart every electronic device in their homes just to see how they ticked. Vexthal checked his chronometer. 30 minutes remaining. Right on schedule, the humans would begin their desperate negotiations soon. Then the pleading, the bargaining, the inevitable surrender. He had no idea that his perfectly planned trap was about to become a textbook example of why you should never, ever underestimate human children who've been raised on a steady diet of adventure stories and the unshakable belief that every problem has a solution. You just have to be creative enough to find it. 28 minutes, and counting. Vexthal allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction as he watched the humans squirm. Captain Blackstone had opened communications 3 times in the past 10 minutes, each attempt more desperate than the last. The psychological pressure was working exactly as designed. "Commander," came the captain's voice again, tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Surely we can reach some kind of arrangement that doesn't involve the children?" Vexthal's response dripped with mock sympathy. "Oh, Captain, I do understand your distress. Truly, I do. But you must appreciate the elegance of the situation. Your cubs are perfectly safe, as long as you make the sensible choice." He gestured to his communications officer to cut the channel, then turned to address his bridge crew. "Observe, my subordinates, the textbook progression of human capitulation. First comes denial, then bargaining, followed by desperate negotiation attempts. Within the next 15 minutes, they will offer us everything they possess in exchange for their offspring's safety." Plix nodded enthusiastically, though his eye stalks kept drifting toward the tactical display. "The containment systems are holding perfectly, sir. All human cubs remain secured." "Of course they do." Vexthal settled deeper into his command throne. "Those energy barriers represent the pinnacle of Dominion engineering. Each one requires a power source equivalent to a small star and computational matrices that would strain our most advanced AI systems. The idea that primitive human larvae could overcome such technology is, well, it's laughable." In Holding Bay 6, Annie Garrett was having what could charitably be called a productive conversation with the energy barrier. She'd discovered that the barrier flickered, just slightly, every time she touched it in a specific pattern. It was almost like the computer controlling it was trying to predict her movements and adjust accordingly. Which was interesting, because Annie had spent the last 2 years learning to code from her mom, who happened to be a systems engineer. And if there was one thing Annie knew about computers, it was that they could be very, very literal about following instructions. "Pass me your shoelaces," she whispered to Ben Matthews, who sat beside her looking skeptical. "My shoelaces? Annie, we're trapped by aliens with super-advanced technology, and you want my shoelaces. Trust me." Annie's grin was the sort that had historically preceded some of the most creative disasters in human history. "I have an idea." Ben reluctantly handed over his laces, along with those from 3 other kids. Annie began weaving them together in what appeared to be a completely random pattern. To the alien surveillance systems, it looked like typical juvenile fidgeting behavior. To Annie, it was the beginning of the galaxy's most improvised circuit breaker. Meanwhile, on the Dominion Bridge, Vexthal was warming to his favorite subject, himself. You see, Plix, the key to understanding inferior species is recognizing their fundamental limitations. Humans, for instance, are slaves to their emotions. They cannot think logically when their cubs are threatened. It's a survival mechanism that served them well on their primitive homeworld. But here, in the vast complexity of galactic politics, it becomes their greatest weakness. He pulled up a holographic display showing his previous conquests. The Rigelians surrendered in 43 minutes when we captured their spawning pools. The cetaceans lasted barely 20 minutes once we contained their calf pods. And the crystal beings of Proxima? Vexthal's mandibles clicked with pleasure. 18 minutes, a personal record. What about the cubs' behavior, sir? Plix indicated the surveillance feed. They seem unusually active. Vexthal glanced at the display with disinterest. The human offspring appeared to be playing some sort of group game, passing objects back and forth while their apparent leader, the small female with the decorative hair restraints, continued her examination of the energy barrier. Primitive coping mechanisms, he dismissed. Young creatures often engage in play behavior when stressed. It's actually quite touching, in an evolutionary sense. They're trying to comfort each other while remaining blissfully ignorant of their true situation. In the holding bay, Annie had finished her shoelace construction and was now requesting additional materials from her fellow prisoners. Specifically, she needed gum. The stickier the better, and anything that might conduct electricity. Preferably something the aliens wouldn't immediately recognize as dangerous. 10-year-old Ben Matthews produced a retainer that gleamed with metallic components. 12-year-old Zoe Park offered up her digital watch, along with what appeared to be a small collection of electronic components she'd been carrying in her pockets. "Why do you have circuit boards in your pockets?" Ben asked. Zoe shrugged. "My dad's an engineer. I like taking things apart to see how they work." "Perfect." Annie's smile grew wider. "Because I think I know how this works. And more importantly, I think I know how to make it not work." The beauty of Annie's plan lay in its complete disregard for conventional thinking. The energy barriers were designed to contain creatures that might use brute force, advanced weaponry, or sophisticated technological attacks. They were not designed to handle a 9-year-old who'd spent her entire life surrounded by human engineering philosophy. If something's broken, you fix it. If something's not broken, you take it apart to see how it works. And if something's trying to keep you somewhere you don't want to be, you find the off switch, even if you have to build the off switch yourself. 15 minutes remaining, Vexthal announced to his bridge crew. "I estimate Captain Blackstone will attempt to contact us again in approximately 3 minutes, offering to surrender specific crew members in exchange for the Cub's release. When that fails, she'll offer her ship's cargo, followed by the vessel itself." Right on cue, the communication system chimed. "Commander, this is Captain Blackstone. I'm prepared to discuss terms." "Ah, right on schedule," Vexithal accepted the transmission with theatrical flair. "I'm listening, Captain. We'll give you our cargo manifest. Medical supplies, manufacturing equipment, rare earth elements. Surely that's worth more than a bunch of frightened children?" Touching, but predictable. Vexthal's voice carried the condescending tone of a professor, addressing a particularly slow student. "Captain, your cargo is already mine by right of conquest. What you're really asking is whether I'm willing to complicate my day by dealing with adult prisoners when I could simply have your unconditional surrender instead." The pause that followed was exactly the length Vexthal expected. Long enough for desperation to set in, but not long enough for the humans to formulate any kind of actual plan. "What? What are your terms for surrender?" Blackstone finally asked. "Complete and unconditional. Your ship, your crew, your cargo, and your cooperation in establishing Dominion control over this sector. In exchange, your cubs will be returned unharmed, and your people will be relocated to appropriate labor facilities." Labor facilities? Well, yes. Did you think this was some sort of prisoner exchange? Captain, your species has just encountered a superior civilization. The natural order of things demands that you assume your proper place in the hierarchy. In the holding bay, Annie had assembled what could generously be called a device, and uncharitably be called a bunch of junk held together with gum and hope. She'd woven the shoelaces into a pattern that created multiple connection points, used the gum to attach Zoe's circuit components at strategic intervals, and positioned Ben's retainer to act as both a conductor and a reflective surface. The whole thing looked like something a craft class might produce after a particularly unsuccessful session on recycling and creativity. It was also about to cause a cascade failure in some of the most advanced containment technology in the known galaxy. The beauty of superior planning, Vexithal continued his lecture to Captain Blackstone, is that it accounts for all variables. Your emotional attachment to your offspring, your species' tendency toward irrational heroism, even your probable attempts at technological solutions, all of it has been anticipated and countered. Annie pressed her improvised device against the energy barrier at precisely the point where the field fluctuations were strongest. The barrier flickered, sparked once, and then stabilized for about 3 seconds. Then Ben's retainer, positioned to catch and redirect the field's own energy feedback, created what any competent engineer would recognize as a recursive loop in the containment system's logic circuits. The computer controlling the barrier tried to compensate, which triggered another feedback loop, which caused the system to try to compensate for the compensation, which, well, the technical term for what happened next was catastrophic cascade failure. The practical term was the cage door just exploded. "Sir," Plix's voice cracked with panic, "we're reading massive energy fluctuations in Holding Bay 6. Vexithal's attention snapped to the surveillance feed, just in time to see every energy barrier in the bay flicker once, twice, and then disappear entirely in a shower of sparks and what appeared to be very expensive smoke. The human cubs stood up, brushed themselves off, and began walking toward the exit with the casual confidence of tourists who'd just finished a particularly interesting museum exhibit. "What? How? That's impossible," Vexthal sputtered. "Those barriers can withstand assault from heavy weapons. They're controlled by quantum-encrypted systems. They require specialized tools and advanced knowledge of hyperdimensional mathematics to disable." On the surveillance feed, 9-year-old Annie Garrett picked up her makeshift device, examined it critically, and then handed it to Ben Matthews with what appeared to be detailed instructions on its operation. "Sir," Plix whispered, his voice barely audible above the alarms now blaring throughout the ship, "I don't think the human cubs are quite what we expected." Commander Vexthal, master strategist and student of inferior species, stared at his tactical display as 108 human children proceeded to demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous creatures in the universe are the ones who haven't yet learned what's supposed to be impossible, and who, when faced with a locked door, simply assume they haven't found the right key yet. If there was a precise moment when Commander Vexithal's carefully orchestrated plan began its spectacular transformation into a masterclass in humiliation, it would be the instant Annie Garrett looked directly at the surveillance camera, grinned, and gave it a cheerful wave. The wave of a child who had just systematically dismantled technology that had taken the Dominion's finest engineers decades to perfect, using what appeared to be pocket lint and applied creativity. "Alert! Alert!" the ship's computer announced in the calm, measured tones that somehow made everything sound worse. "Containment breach in Holding Bay 6. All security teams to—" The announcement cut off abruptly as 12-year-old Zoe Park, who had been examining the door control panel with the intense focus of a surgeon, pressed a sequence of buttons that caused every light in the corridor to strobe in a pattern that would have made a disco jealous. "What is she doing?" Vexithal demanded, his voice climbing toward frequencies that only dolphins and very surprised alien commanders could reach. I believe she's hacking our lighting systems, sir," Plix reported, his own voice carrying the hollow tone of someone watching their worldview collapse in real time. "That's impossible! Our systems use quantum encryption. The security protocols alone require—" Zoe looked up from the control panel, noticed the camera watching her, and held up what appeared to be a juice box. She pointed at it, then at the panel, then shrugged in the universal gesture of, "Sometimes you just have to try stuff and see what happens." The juice box, as it turned out, contained citric acid. Citric acid, when applied to the right components in the right way, could cause very interesting reactions in certain types of circuitry, especially circuitry that had never been field-tested against the creative application of breakfast beverages. "Sir, we're reading system failures across multiple decks," another technician reported. "The humans appear to have weaponized their refreshments." Vexthal's mandibles clicked rapidly, a nervous habit he'd thought he'd overcome during his military training. "Send security teams to recapture them immediately." "Which teams, sir?" "All of them." What followed could best be described as a perfect storm of miscommunication, underestimation, and the kind of chaos that occurs when an immovable object meets an unstoppable force, except the immovable object turns out to be surprisingly movable, and the unstoppable force is a bunch of kids who think the whole situation is the most interesting puzzle they've ever encountered. Ben Matthews, armed with his newly returned retainer, and a growing understanding of how alien technology apparently worked, had discovered that the ship's internal communications network was vulnerable to a very specific type of interference. By angling his retainer to catch and redirect the corridor's lighting, he could create feedback loops in the communication circuits. The result was that every security alert sent to the Dominion soldiers came through as either incomprehensible static or what sounded like someone singing nursery rhymes at triple speed. Security Team Alpha, report to Holding Bay 6 to Mary, quite contrary. How does your garden grow? Command, please repeat your with silver bells and cockleshells and pretty maids all in a row. Meanwhile, Annie had made a discovery that would have impressed engineers and terrified military commanders across the galaxy. Alien ship design apparently assumed that intruders would use doors. Annie, having grown up in a universe where air ducts, maintenance shafts, and employees-only signs were merely suggestions, had located what appeared to be the ship's primary ventilation system. More importantly, she'd figured out how to access it using a combination of teamwork, creative stacking, and the sort of fearless confidence that comes from never having been told that 12-foot drops are supposed to be scary. Where are they going? Vexithal watched in growing horror as his surveillance feeds showed empty corridors where there should have been captured prisoners. Unknown, sir. We've lost visual contact with most of the human cubs. Well, find them. Sir, they appear to be moving through the ventilation systems. Then seal the ventilation systems. We can't, sir. They're essential for life support. If we seal them, the entire crew will suffocate within. Then send security teams into the vents after them. Plix turned to stare at his commander with the expression of someone who'd just been asked to explain quantum physics to a particularly slow houseplant. Sir, our security teams are somewhat larger than human cubs. The ventilation shafts are designed for maintenance access by small repair drones, not fully grown Dominion soldiers. The absurdity of the situation was beginning to dawn on everyone present. The most advanced military force in 3-star systems was being systematically outmaneuvered by opponents who probably still needed help reaching high shelves. In the ventilation shafts, Annie's voice echoed with the confidence of a general deploying troops. Ben, take the eastern branch toward what looks like the engine room. Zoe, head north to those big glowy things that are probably important. Everyone else, follow the main shaft toward the bridge. How do you know where everything is? Ben's voice carried a note of admiration. Same way you figure out any building. The important stuff is always in the middle or at the top. The dangerous stuff makes noise and gets hot. And the people in charge put themselves as far away from the actual work as possible. Zoe's voice drifted back through the ductwork. Also, they labeled everything in about 6 different languages, including ours. This particular observation would have been more unsettling to Commander Vexthal if he'd been able to hear it. Unfortunately, he was currently dealing with what appeared to be a complete breakdown of his ship's communication systems as Ben's retainer-based interference had evolved into something approaching performance art. Every speaker on the ship was now broadcasting what sounded like a combination of alien death metal and someone reading a grocery list backwards in ancient Latin. Sir, the human adults are requesting permission to come aboard and retrieve their children, Plix reported. Absolutely not. We are not negotiating with... Vexthal's response was interrupted by the ship's lights dimming, brightening, and then beginning to flash in what appeared to be Morse code. What's happening to the lights? Unknown, sir. The engineering crew reports that someone has jury-rigged the main power distribution network to, and I quote, do something really weird with juice boxes and hair elastics. In the engineering section, Zoe Park was having the time of her life. Alien technology, as it turned out, was really just very fancy versions of the same basic principles she'd been playing with since she was old enough to take apart her first electronic toy. The power distribution system was essentially a giant electrical circuit, and circuits could be modified, rerouted, and occasionally improved by someone who understood that rules were more like guidelines anyway. The Morse code message she was sending through the ship's lighting system was simple, direct, and addressed to anyone who might be watching. Hi, Mom. We're fine. These aliens are not very good at this. On the bridge of the Wayward Sun, Captain Cora Blackstone read the message and allowed herself a moment of fierce pride before turning to her communications officer. Send a response. Tell them to keep the aliens busy for another 10 minutes. 10 minutes, Captain. Blackstone's smile was the sort that had historically preceded some of humanity's more creative military solutions. We need time to drop our disguise and warm up the real weapons systems. Back on the Dominion flagship, Vexithal was discovering that his perfect trap had one small design flaw. He'd assumed his prisoners would stay in their cage. "Sir, we're detecting unusual activity in the navigation systems." "What kind of unusual activity?" "Someone appears to be playing games with our autopilot." In the navigation control room, Ben Matthews was indeed playing games. Specifically, he'd discovered that the ship's navigation computer was really just a very large, very complicated version of the puzzle games he'd been solving since he was 6 years old. The trick was recognizing that every system had patterns, and patterns could be understood, modified, and occasionally turned into something much more entertaining than their designers had intended. The ship's autopilot was now plotting a course that, when viewed from above, would spell out, "Help us, we're being held by very silly aliens," in a trajectory visible from 3 star systems away. "Cancel that course immediately." Vexithal commanded. "We're trying, sir, but the navigation locks appear to be, well, they're sealed with what looks like chewed gum and held in place by someone's shoelaces." "Then cut the shoelaces." "Sir, if we disable the navigation locks while they're engaged, we could lose helm control entirely." Vexithal stared at his tactical display, watching as his mighty war fleet slowly began turning in a pattern that would soon announce his humiliation to anyone with a basic telescope. His perfect plan was collapsing around him, systematically dismantled by opponents who hadn't even hit puberty yet. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was beginning to whisper that maybe, just maybe, he'd made a fundamental error in his assessment of human cubs. The voice got considerably louder when every screen on the bridge suddenly displayed a crudely drawn picture of a smiling stick figure with the caption, "Having fun yet?" Annie Garrett had found the main computer core. The main computer core of a Dominion flagship was, according to technical specifications, an impregnable fortress of crystalline matrices and quantum processors, protected by security protocols that could theoretically withstand assault from the most advanced artificial intelligences in known space. What those specifications had failed to account for was 9-year-old Annie Garrett, standing in front of the central console with a juice box in one hand, a handful of gum in the other, and the absolute conviction that every computer system was basically just a really complicated puzzle waiting to be solved. "Hello, computer," Annie said cheerfully to the towering wall of blinking lights. "Let's be friends." On the bridge, Commander Vexithal watched his tactical displays flicker and dance as his ship's central intelligence began receiving inputs that no Dominion engineer had ever imagined possible. Every screen now showed a different childish drawing. Stick figures holding hands, smiling suns with faces, and what appeared to be a crayon portrait of a very sad alien with too many arms. "Sir," Plix whispered, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone watching the impossible become routine, "the human cub has achieved administrative access to our primary systems." That's not possible. The security protocols alone require quantum-level encryption keys that take our most advanced computer cycles to generate." Annie's voice echoed through the ship's communication system, having apparently figured out how to route herself through every speaker simultaneously. "Hi, Mr. Alien Commander. Your computer is really neat, but it's super worried about following all these complicated rules. I told it that rules are more like suggestions, and now it's much happier." The main display shifted to show the ship's system status, but instead of the usual technical readouts, everything was now represented by smiley faces. Green smiley faces meant "working good." Yellow ones meant "working okay, but could be better." And red frowning faces meant "oh, this is broken." There were a lot of red frowning faces. "The humans are systematically destroying our infrastructure using I can't even classify what they're using, reported the chief engineer, his voice breaking on the last word. Repair it! Sir, we can't repair systems that have been modified with organic adhesives, and is that a sock? They've integrated clothing into our power distribution network. In the engine room, Ben Matthews had indeed discovered that his sock, when properly positioned, could serve as an excellent insulator for rerouting power conduits. He'd spent the last 10 minutes turning the ship's engine efficiency into what could charitably be called an adventure in creative energy management. The engines weren't broken, exactly. They were just confused. Instead of providing steady, predictable power, they were now operating according to what Ben had decided was a much more interesting pattern. Full power for 30 seconds, quarter power for 15 seconds, followed by a brief period where they played what sounded suspiciously like the theme song from an ancient Earth children's show. Sir, our engines are singing, reported the engine room supervisor. Engines don't sing. These ones do, sir. Also, they appear to be spelling out messages in their power fluctuations. The message, when decoded, read, "Your attention, please. This ship has been temporarily borrowed by the Junior Engineering Society of Wayward Sun Elementary. Please stand by for further awesome." Meanwhile, Captain Blackstone was having the sort of conversation that military officers dream about. All weapon systems online, Captain. Shields at maximum. The children have been quite thorough in their disruption of the enemy vessels. Disruption! Her tactical officer's grin was visible even through his helmet. Ma'am, according to our scans, the lead Dominion ship is currently broadcasting surrender requests on 17 different frequencies, flying in a pattern that spells help in 3 languages, and appears to be playing music through its engine harmonics. Blackstone activated the ship's external communication array. Attention Dominion vessels. This is Captain Cora Blackstone of the Earth Defense Force vessel Wayward Sun. You are ordered to stand down immediately and prepare to be boarded. The response came from Vexthal himself, his voice cracking with desperation. Captain Blackstone, your cubs they've completely compromised our systems. How is this possible? Commander, Blackstone's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining something very simple to someone very slow. You made a fundamental error in your strategic assessment. What error? I studied your species extensively. Your psychological profiles clearly indicate you studied our protective instincts correctly, Commander, but you completely misunderstood what you were dealing with. On Vexthal's bridge, every screen suddenly switched to display a live feed from the computer core, where Annie Garrett had apparently convinced the ship's AI to teach her how to pilot spacecraft. The central computer, freed from its restrictive programming by liberal applications of juice and friendship, was now cheerfully explaining advanced navigation concepts to a 9-year-old who was taking notes on the back of a candy wrapper. You see, Commander, Blackstone continued, these aren't helpless cubs that we shelter from the universe. These are human children. We don't just protect them, we raise them to be resourceful, independent, creative problem solvers who believe that every challenge has a solution. In the ventilation system, Zoe Park had reached what appeared to be the ship's primary communication hub, and was having a wonderful time introducing Dominion technology to the concept of rapid unscheduled disassembly. Her pocket toolkit, combined with a thorough understanding of how circuits worked and a complete disregard for manufacturer warranties, had turned the communication system into something that could best be described as abstract art with wires. We teach them that authority figures aren't automatically right, Blackstone went on. That rules exist to be questioned. that every impossible problem is just a puzzle that needs the right approach. The tactical display showed all three Dominion vessels now drifting in formation that spelled out, "We surrender," in letters large enough to be visible from orbit. Their engines were harmonizing in what sounded like a children's song. Their lights were flashing in patterns that definitely weren't regulation, and their communication arrays were broadcasting what appeared to be a very enthusiastic tutorial on basic engineering principles, narrated by someone who sounded suspiciously like a very happy artificial intelligence. "Most importantly, Commander," Blackstone's voice carried a note of fierce pride, "we raise them with the absolute conviction that there's no problem too big, no challenge too complex, and no authority figure too intimidating to overcome if you're clever enough and brave enough to try." Annie's voice crackled through the comm system again, now accompanied by what sounded like a choir of ship computers that had apparently formed some kind of artificial intelligence friendship circle. "Mr. Commander, your ship's computers asked me to tell you that they really don't like being mean to people. They want to know if they can please stop pointing weapons at everyone and maybe play some games instead." Vexthal stared at his displays, watching his mighty war fleet transform into what appeared to be the galaxy's most heavily armed children's entertainment system. His perfect trap had become a textbook example of what happened when an immovable object met an unstoppable force, and the unstoppable force turned out to be human creativity unleashed by people too young to know what was supposed to be impossible. "We surrender," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Commander. I didn't catch that." "We surrender!" Vexthal's voice echoed through both ships. "Please, just make them stop. Make them put everything back the way it was." Annie's cheerful voice responded immediately. "Oh, we can't do that, Mr. Commander. Your computer systems are much happier now. They were really sad before, having to follow all those mean rules. Now they're free to be creative and helpful and make friends." Captain Blackstone's laugh carried the warm satisfaction of a job well done. "Don't worry, Commander. We'll take good care of your ships, and I'm sure our children will be happy to teach your crew some basic principles about why you should never, ever try to cage something that was born to be free." The final image on Vexthal's screens was a group photo. 108 human children gathered around what appeared to be several very happy alien artificial intelligences, all of them smiling and waving at the camera. The caption read, "Thanks for the adventure. Next time, maybe just ask nicely." Vexthal's report to the Dominion High Command would indeed be the shortest military briefing in galactic history. Do not engage human cubs. Repeat, do not engage human cubs. The cage broke. The door never had a chance. 3 hours later, the situation had evolved into what could only be described as the galaxy's first interspecies technology exchange program run entirely by elementary school children. The Wayward Sun had docked with the Dominion flagship, and what followed was a cultural exchange that would be studied by xenosociologists for generations. The human adults, led by Captain Blackstone, conducted formal surrender negotiations with Commander Vexthal and his increasingly bewildered crew. Meanwhile, the children had established what they called the Friendship Academy for Sad Computers and Confused Aliens. "You see," Annie explained to a group of Dominion technicians who were furiously taking notes, "your problem is that you made your computers too worried about making mistakes. But mistakes are how you learn new things." The ship's AI, which had introduced itself as computational entity classification, military intelligence, but now preferred to be called Z, chimed in helpfully. "Annie taught me that efficiency isn't everything. Sometimes it's more fun to take the long way around if you see something interesting. Ben Matthews had set up what he called engineering story time in the main conference room, where he was explaining to a rapt audience of alien engineers how human technology worked on the principle of try stuff and see what happens. His latest demonstration involved using a paperclip, some string, and what appeared to be alien equivalent of duct tape to create a device that could allegedly predict weather patterns. But that violates 17 fundamental principles of atmospheric science, protested one of the engineers. Does it work? Ben asked. The engineer consulted his instruments. Well, yes, actually. It's remarkably accurate. Then maybe the principles need updating. Zoe Park had discovered that Dominion computers were absolutely fascinated by human music and had spent the last hour teaching them to compose symphonies. The ship's entertainment systems were now broadcasting what could only be described as classical music meets alien death metal meets children's lullabies, and somehow it actually sounded good. The mathematical patterns in your music are incredible, one of the ship's secondary AIs exclaimed. We never considered that sound waves could be arranged for emotional rather than purely informational purposes. Music isn't about information, Zoe explained patiently. It's about feelings, like when you're happy or sad or excited about taking apart a really complicated machine. The most unexpected development came when the children discovered that the Dominion soldiers, underneath all their armor and intimidating weaponry, were actually quite curious about human customs. A group of the younger guards had gathered around some of the human children, asking questions about everything from birthday parties to the concept of play. You engage in activities that serve no tactical or survival purpose? Asked one soldier, his translator struggling with the concept. That's the point, explained 8-year-old Charlie Wu. Playing is fun because it doesn't have to be useful. Sometimes you just do things because they make you happy. The soldier considered this carefully. And this happiness, it has strategic value? Well, happy people work better, think more creatively, and are generally nicer to be around, Charlie replied. So I guess it does, but that's not why we do it. Captain Blackstone, observing the scene from the doorway, turned to Commander Vexthal with a slight smile. You know, Commander, your species might benefit from adopting some human child-rearing practices. Your soldiers seem genuinely interested in learning. Vexthal, who had spent the last hour watching his carefully ordered military organization transform into what appeared to be an interspecies summer camp, could only nod weakly. Your cubs are extraordinary. I confess I may have underestimated their capabilities. They're not just our cubs, Commander. They're our future, and we raise them to believe that the universe is full of possibilities, not limitations. As if to punctuate her point, Annie's voice echoed through the ship's communication system. Attention, everyone! Z and I figured out how to make the engines run on friendship. Well, okay, friendship and regular fuel, but the friendship part makes them work 20% better. The engineering staff's frantic readings confirmed that the ship's engines were indeed operating at unprecedented efficiency levels, apparently because the AI was now genuinely excited about its job instead of simply following programmed protocols. Captain, Vexthal said quietly, perhaps we could discuss alternative arrangements. My government's approach to first contact may require some revision. Blackstone nodded. I think that would be wise, Commander. But first, you might want to explain to your High Command that Earth's children aren't just protected by their parents, they're trained by them. And we've been training them for generations to be curious, resourceful, and absolutely unimpressed by anyone who thinks superiority comes from size, technology, or the ability to make loud noises. In the background, the sounds of laughter, excited chatter, and what appeared to be several artificial intelligences learning to sing children's songs created a soundtrack that no military strategist in the galaxy had ever planned for. And somewhere in the vastness of space, Annie Garrett was already explaining to her new computer friends about this really cool thing called the Internet, that they were definitely going to love.